1 potato, 2 potato, 3 potato, 4. Can you finish that rhyme? Today we're going to talk about children's poetry. Hi there, I'm Linda Maxey, the author of the Library Lynn Guides to Great Nonfiction Books and the author of an upcoming paranormal women's fiction novel. Now, I've been wanting to do a video on children's poetry since I began a YouTube channel over a year ago. I've been putting it off though because it's such a huge topic. I knew I could never do it justice. But the time has come, the walrus said. Do you recognize that bit of poetry? Do you know where it came from and who wrote it? Stay tuned to the end and I'll reveal both to you and you can see if you're right or not. Now, I'm not going to do today's video the way I normally do videos. If you've been watching me for a while, you know that I'm always heavily scripted, and the reason for that is simple. I'm an extreme introvert. If they had introvert Olympics, I would qualify for the team. And that being the case, I really can't talk and think at the same time. But for this video, I simply can't write down everything that I want to say. So I'm going to do the best I can. I'm jotting down notes on the 10 books I'm going to show you today. And of course, this introduction is scripted. I'm not expecting miracles from myself. I have a poem picked out to read from each book. But that's pretty much it. So today I'm going to swing without a safety net, and who knows, this may be the best video I've done yet. Nothing ventured, nothing gained, as they say. Now, I was a children's librarian for years before I finished my career in a high school. I've worked in elementary schools and public libraries as a children's librarian, and I've always loved children's poetry. Now, this is a little odd because I can't say I love poetry for adults. Maybe this is a sad commentary on my state of maturity. I don't know, but that really wouldn't surprise me. But the fact is, children's poetry has always struck me as joyful and surprising. It's refreshing, and good children's poetry can take me right back to how I felt as a child, desperate to understand the world around me and a need for reassurance that even if things don't make sense, it was ultimately okay. I've been reading through these books to get ready for this video, and I want to say this. None of these books are new. They're all at least 20 years old. I would imagine that if I compared these books to new children's poetry books, the newer ones would be tamer in some ways. There's been a big movement to protect children from anything that adults find offensive. And while some of this is warranted and it's nothing new, the fact is many children encounter all sorts of things that adults wish they didn't. I think children are smarter and tougher than we give them credit for. What I'm getting at is that some of these poems in these volumes would not pass acceptability tests for adults today. Some of this would be for good reason. Some of these poems betray the prejudices and blind spots of the society in which their writers lived. On the other hand, some wouldn't be accepted because they're too honest about the feelings children sometimes have. These, I think it's a mistake to gloss over because children feel things deeply. And I think their feelings and viewpoints should be taken as seriously and respected just like in adults. What I'm trying to say here is a disclaimer. If you decide to pick up new or used copies of any of these collections I show you today, you may find problems with some of the poems that are in the books. Keep that in mind before you spend money on them. Okay, with the trigger warnings out of the way, let's get started. I'm going to go through these books in the order I had them stacked up. There's no underlying structure as to how they are presented here. Okay, we're going to start with Now We Are Six by A.A. Milne. This is one of the books he wrote for his son, Christopher Robin. At age 6, Christopher Robin was much too young to enjoy the poems in When We Were Very Young, so these are for the more mature boy. It's full of adventure and friends, both the stuffed animal and the human kind. The illustrations are by Ernest Shepard, and the book was published in 1927. The copy I have is a reprint from 1943. I'm going to read the poem The Friend. There are lots and lots of people who are always asking things, like dates and pounds and ounces, and the names of funny kings. And the answer's either 6 or 100 inches long. And I know they'll think I'm silly if I get the answers wrong. So Pooh and I go whispering, and Pooh looks very bright and says, "Well, I say 6, but I don't suppose I'm right. And then it doesn't matter what the answer ought to be. 'Cause if he's right, I'm right. And if he's wrong, It isn't me. The next book is Rhymes and Verses, Collected Poems for the Very Young by Walter de la Mare. Now, I fell in love with Walter de la Mare's poetry before I even started elementary school. A cousin gave me his 4th grade reading book, Roads to Everywhere, and y'all, you're about to discover some disturbing things about me as a child. Here's the book. This is my copy that my cousin gave me. It was in much better shape when I got it than it is now. My mother read me stories from this book, and I just loved a poem in here by Walter de la Mare called Someone. This poem has captivated me all my life. It's mysterious yet charming. So I'm going to read that poem to you now. And you can see I wrote all over this book. I don't know why. I loved this book. I loved everything about it. But once I learned to write, right around 1st grade, I went through it and just started circling things and marking things out. And I think it was a rebellion against school. I wanted to go to school. I was so excited to begin school, but I was horrified when I got there and found out that I had to sit in a chair most of the day. And I had to do exactly what the teacher told me all day. It made me angry. And so I think some of it I took out on my books, and my mother was very disappointed in me, and I don't blame her. But here's the poem. Someone came knocking at my wee small door. Someone came knocking. I'm sure, sure, sure. I listened. I opened. I looked from left to right, but naught there was a stirring in the still dark night. Only the busy beetle tapping on the wall. Only from the forest the screech owl's call. Only the cricket whistling while the dewdrops fall. So I know not who came knocking at all, at all, at all. Okay, so I was so enchanted with that poem that when I found this book in a library catalog after my son was born, I just had to buy it. Walter de la Mare was a British writer who published novels and plays, but he's best known for his children's poetry. This book was published in 1947 before de la Mare died in 1956. This copy of the book was reissued in 1988, and the book was illustrated by Eleanor Blasdell. Now, from this book, I'm going to read the poem, The Old House. A very, very old house I know, and ever so many people go past the small lodge forlorn and still, under the heavy branches till comes to the blank wall, and there's the door. Go in they do, come out no more. No voice says aught. No spark of light across that threshold cheers the sight. Only the evening star on high, less lonely makes a lonely sky. As one by one the people go into that very old house I know. That one kind of gives me the chills. Okay, the next one is Piper, Pipe That Song Again. Poems for Boys and Girls, selected by Nancy Larrick, who was the author of A Parent's Guide to Children's Reading and A Parent's Guide to Children's Education. She was an internationally recognized expert on children's reading back in the mid-20th century. I'm going to read you her illustration, but not a poem from the book. And I love this illustration. Long ago, before radio and television and printed books, wandering musicians went from one village to another, singing songs and reciting poems. Sometimes they would perform in the castle, sometimes in the courtyard of an inn or in the village square. From far and near, people gathered to hear these minstrels, as they were called. Often the songs were old ones that people had learned from their fathers and grandfathers. The words were those that they had grown up with, and the tunes were almost a part of them. One of the earliest musical instruments was a hollow reed called a pipe. It makes a flute-like sound as lilting as the song of an oriole. The Indians of Peru use reed pipes today. In a village market, you can buy a pipe for a few pennies. A shepherd boy will pipe a song as he follows his flock across the plains. We're told that some of the early minstrels used the same kind of reed pipe. The piper would begin to play as he came into town. Children would follow him to catch every note. Men and women would linger to hear the haunting tunes and perhaps join in with the words they knew. If the piper stopped, someone would call out, "Piper, pipe that song again." Then the wonderful combination of words and music would begin again. Today, we have no wandering poet-musicians to bring us the sound of poetry, but we have a legacy from them in our printed books of poetry. Here our poets have recorded their songs for everyone to enjoy. They have used paper and ink instead of reed pipes, and their own singing voices, but the melody is there for any reader to hear and to sing as he reads. By itself, the printed word is a silent thing, but as you read the words of a poem, it becomes a musical thing. It may have a gay, laughing melody, or it may have the soft melody you have heard in swaying grass. Poems are meant to be read aloud, just as songs are meant to be sung aloud. As you read a poem again and again, it becomes a part of you. The rhythm seems to flow from you the way a song you love pours out as you sing, and you will want to enjoy it time after time. And indeed, you have become a piper who can pipe that song again. And I forgot to mention the illustrations in this book are by Kelly O'Shealy, and I may be pronouncing that incorrectly. Now, the next book is also gathered together by Nancy Larrick. It's called Piping Down the Valleys Wild, Poetry for the Young of All Ages. This one was published in 1968, and the illustrations were done by Ellen Raskin, who was a children's illustrator, but also a celebrated children's author herself. She's best known for writing The Westing Game, which you may have read if you're lucky. It's an excellent mystery for children, and it won the Newbery Medal for Children's Literature in 1979. I'm going to read you Full of the Moon by Carla Cuskin. It's full of the moon, the dogs dance out through brush and bush and bramble. They howl and yowl and growl and prowl. They amble, ramble, scramble. They rush through brush, they push through bush, they yip and yap and hurr. They lark around and bark around with prickles in their fur. They two-step in the meadow, they polka on the lawn. Tonight's the night the dogs dance out and chase their tails till dawn. The next is the Everyman Book of Nonsense Verse, which was edited and introduced by Louise Guinness. It was published in 2004. Now, I couldn't find anything out about Louise Guinness unless she's the same Louise Guinness who is married to the heir of the Guinness Brewery in Ireland. But this Louise Guinness did edit and select poems for several volumes of poetry. I don't remember when or why I bought this book. Some of the illustrations were done by Quentin Blake, who is best known for his illustrations of Roald Dahl's books. Others were done by Emma Chichester Clark, a British illustrator who has illustrated more than 60 books, including The Rescue of Bunny Wunny and Bears Don't Read. And Edward Gorey's rhymes are accompanied by his own illustrations. This is a nice addition. I'm going to read you The Yak. Our yak. We are very depressed with our yak, which has now become terribly slack. It cleaned kitchens and stairs better than many au pairs, but now we're going to send our yak back. All right, next is a classic. A Child's Garden of Verses by Robert Louis Stevenson. I love everything about Robert Louis Stevenson, right down to his name. It strikes me as poetic all on its own. Now, many people know that Stevenson, the author of Treasure Island, was an invalid when he was a child, and he spent many lonely hours in Scotland, tucked alone in his bed, playing by himself. I think he's a genius. Many editions of this book have been published, and I bought this one when my first son was born. And even when he was less than a year old, he would sit in my lap and listen to these poems. It was published in 1985, and the illustrations are by Jessie Wilcox Smith, who is one of America's most celebrated children's illustrators. Most of her work was done in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, what has been called the golden age of children's illustrations. I'm going to read the last poem in the book. It always makes me tear up, so hopefully I won't get too emotional when I read it. I don't know what it is about this poem, but it gets to me. To any reader, as from the house your mother sees you playing round the garden trees, so you may see, if you will look through the windows of this book, another child, far, far away, in another garden play. I do not think you can at all, by knocking on the window, call that child to hear you. He, intent on all his play business bent, he does not hear, he will not look, nor yet be lured out of this book. For long ago, the truth to say, he has grown up and gone away, and it is but a child of air that lingers in the garden there. The next book is The New Kid on the Block, Poems by Jack Prelutsky. This book was published in 1984, and the illustrations are by James Stevenson, who illustrated over 100 children's books in his long career. Several of them were poetry collections by Prelutsky. Prelutsky's poems, like Shel Silverstein's, talk about the dark side of childhood. He doesn't pretty things up, but he's often spot on in how children see things and feel about things. I've always tried to sneak poetry into lessons with elementary school students with varying degrees of success depending on the crowd I was working with, but I could pretty much universally depend on Prelutsky's poems to be big hits. We're going to read Mean Maxine. There's no one mean as Mean Maxine. She smells like old cigars. Her brain is smaller than a bean. I wish she'd move to Mars. Someday I'll list the things I hate, and that is where I'll list her. I'd like to pack her in a crate. Too bad Maxine's my sister. And the next one is Something Silky. This is a very short one, but I think it could have been written for adults. Something silky, scarcely there, ghostly and diaphanous, stole our socks and underwear and had a ghastly laugh at us. The next is one of my favorites. It's The Golden Treasury of Poetry, selected by Louis Untermeyer and illustrated by Joan Walsh Unglin. Golden Press, who did Little Golden Books, first published this in 1958, and the copy I have was reprinted in the year I was born, 1962. I first saw this book in my first job right out of college in an elementary school where I was the librarian in Damascus, Virginia. This book was on the shelves and I quickly made use of it, reading it to the classes there. I love this book and I never forgot it, and about 10 years later, I found it in a used bookstore in Salem, Virginia, and snatched it up. And I still read this book to me all the time. I mean, I read it to myself. I tried to read a poem a day from it to my boys when they were small. I would try to read one poem after lunch every day. They weren't really interested, so I gave it up. But, you know, everybody's different. You might have a child in your life that would love this book. It's a charming and beautiful book. I absolutely love the illustrations. But do keep in mind that the outlook of some of the poems no longer fit the modern sensibility. But many of them are classics, and I just love the illustrations. Here's what he says on the back cover. This is a book to grow on. It's also a book to grow with. If these pages are poems that will become favorites, you'll never lose your taste for them. They will be part of you as long as you live. These verses, the nimble and the nonsensical, as well as the greatly meaningful, delighted me when I was young. They still delight me today. You will laugh at some of these poems. You will learn from others. Some of them will be exciting new experiences. Some will let you see familiar things as though you had never seen them before. But all of them were meant primarily to be enjoyed. And not all of these poems are for children, I will add. Some of them were written for adults, but children can enjoy them too. Okay, the next one is Old Possum's Book of Practical Cats by T.S. Eliot. Now, I had never heard of this book until I went to spend May session in England right after I graduated from college. One of my English professors took about 20 of us over to tour England with an emphasis on literature and the arts. It was one of the best trips I ever took in my entire life. One day in a park, I wish I could remember which one. It was in London. I don't remember, but we were all exhausted and he let us sit down and rest one afternoon while he read poems from this book to us out loud. Now, the reason for his selection was that night we were going to see Cats, performed live on the London stage that very night. I was one of the lucky ones who got to sit on the revolving stage. I was in the third row. I enjoyed the show, but no more than the poems themselves. I've treasured this book ever since. The illustrations for this copy were done by the incomparable Edward Gorey, who is one of my all-time favorite illustrators. And I'm going to read to you the very first poem in the book, The Naming of Cats. The naming of cats is a difficult matter, and I'm sorry. All right, I'm going to stop right there. I'm sorry. I can't help but be influenced by the way they did it in the Broadway show. Thank you, Andrew Lloyd Webber. The naming of cats is a difficult matter. It isn't just one of your holiday games. You may think at first I'm as mad as a hatter when I tell you that a cat must have 3 different names. First of all, there's the names that the family use daily, such as Peter, Augustus, Alonzo, or James, such as Victor or Jonathan, George, or Bill Bailey. All of them sensible, everyday names. There are fancier names if you think they sound sweeter. Some for the gentlemen, some for the dames, such as Plato, Admetus, Electra, Demeter, but all of them sensible, everyday names. But I can tell you A cat needs a name that's particular, a name that's peculiar and more dignified. Else how can he keep up his tail perpendicular, or spread out his whiskers, or cherish his pride? Of names of this kind I can give you a quorum, such as Monkstrap, Quaxo, or Coricapat. Sorry about that. Such as Bomboberlina, or else Jelly Lorum, names that never belong to more than one cat. But above and beyond, there's still one name left over, and that is the name that you will never guess, the name that no human research can discover, but the cat himself knows and will never confess. When you notice a cat in profound meditation, the reason I tell you is always the same. His mind is engaged in a rapt contemplation of the thought of his name, his ineffable, ineffable, deep and inscrutable, singular name. Okay, and the last book, the Random House Book of Poetry for Children, a treasury of 572 poems for today's child, which were selected by Jack Prelutsky, though not all of them were written by him, and it was illustrated by Arnold Lobel. The book was published in 1983, obviously by Random House, and we already talked about Jack Prelutsky. Arnold Lobel was known for many, many books, but probably best known for his illustrations of the Frog and Toad books. Like other anthologies, this one is arranged by broad topic, things like nature, food, animals, children, and nonsense. The poems are newer than the ones in the Golden Book of Children's Poetry. I think it would definitely be a better choice of all the ones I have if you're wanting to read the selections to a child. I'm going to read Leave Me Alone by the incomparable Phyllis Holman. Loving care, too much to bear, leave me alone. Don't brush my hair, don't pat my head, don't tuck me tonight in bed. Don't ask me if I want a sweet, don't fix my favorite things to eat, don't give me lots of good advice, and most of all, just don't be nice. But when I've wallowed well in sorrow, be nice to me again tomorrow. Okay, and finally, I can't skip Nikki Giovanni. We're going to read Basketball. When Spanky goes to the playground, all the big boys say, "Hey, big time, what's happening?" Because his brother plays basketball for their high school, and he gives them the power sign and says, "You got it." But when I go and say, "What's the word?" they just say, "Your nose is running, Junior. One day I'll be 7 feet tall, even if I never get a big brother. And then I'll stuff that sweaty ball down their laughing throats." See what I mean? Okay, and the quote from the beginning of the book, "The time has come," the walrus said. That is from The Walrus and the Carpenter by Lewis Carroll, and it was presented in his book Through the Looking Glass. Do you have a favorite children's poem or a children's poet? Who would you recommend to read to kids? Leave a comment below and let me know. I really enjoyed this video, and I hope you have too. Maybe you can hear my dog is barking to be let out, so I need to go. So until next time, happy reading.